Hello, and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin, and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from all around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture, and where you can see these represented in modern day content, so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. I'm back from my little trip to Paris, which was good fun, although very, very wet and rainy. And whilst I didn't think I'd be happy to be back home in the UK, I am very happy to be back with my cats and the new Diablo 4 expansion, obviously. But we are going to come away from the UK and head over to the US for this one, and we're going into the realm of urban legends again this week, which is one of my favourite types of monster to cover. And for this one, we are looking at the infamous Hook Man, or just the Hook. Before we start, I just want to do a disclaimer. This episode is a bit spookier than usual and definitely a bit more gory in terms of story. So if you've got kids or smaller ones listening to this, even if you're a teenager and you get spooked by stuff, I'd recommend skipping this one for now until you can process it, because boy, I can tell you that urban legends really screwed up my small brain when I was a child. So the warning is there. On your head be it if you decide to listen. So, what is the Hook? Who is the Hook? They are described as an urban legend, and so often referred to as a spirit or some kind of supernatural entity. And this is completely humanoid, with the face of an older man with a white beard, wearing a long raincoat and a hat, with one of his hands replaced with a shiny silver hook. He is always described as an older man, but we never see any facial features, and to be honest, we usually only see him portrayed as a silhouette with a horrible hooky shadow just leering over old-fashioned cars. He is an absolute merciless killer of teenagers, and his only motivation is to kill as many as possible. This is because, as it is written, I'm not saying this just to be performative, he most likely has a mental health issue, but most likely it's because he's just a murderous psychopath. He doesn't have any powers other than appearing in places that he probably couldn't have by usual means, and he is extremely ruthless in his pursuit for blood. Unlike his popular movie counterpart, the Candyman, who I might cover as a fun fictional one at some point, he cannot be summoned in the mirror by calling his name 3 times. We are talking about 2 completely different entities, but one is a movie character inspired by the original urban legend. Speaking of which, it does come from the US, but we don't know exactly what state. It's kind of widespread across the whole of the United States, but it's definitely the state that you're in right now. It is October, it's spooky season. Let me have it. The Hookman will just rock up with his hook. Sometimes he is depicted as an amputee with a hook hand, and in other tellings he just uses the hook as a weapon. But either way, he is very skilled at using it. So why teenagers for his victims? Well, because they're the perfect audience for horror movies, of course. But in all seriousness, there are some proper theories about this, and we'll go into them later on. So, the most important part, and the bit you're waiting for, is the legend of the Hookman. And I know I tell a good story, so buckle in, have your cup of tea ready, here we go. It starts with a rainy night. A young couple canoodling in the car with the radio playing. Suddenly, a news bulletin comes on. A serial killer with a hook has just escaped from a nearby institution. Stay in your homes. The woman sees a silhouette of a man with a hook hand watching them, and the man leaves the car to confront a figure who just isn't there. He then returns to the car and finds his date butchered by a hook. There are a couple different versions of this. One is that instead of a lover's lane situation, which this would be in, the couple run out of petrol or their car breaks down. Then when the man is out of the car, the woman turns on the radio to get the bulletin, then hears a thumping on the roof, the man's severed head. In another version, the woman sees the man's butchered body suspended upside down from a tree with its fingernails scraping against the car roof. But there are a whole load of variations to this story, and they usually end up with either or both party members murdered, or they get away with the killer on the roof of the car, or even sometimes disguised as a policeman in some cases. I think the most horror movie-esque one is when a young couple's car breaks down and the man then decides to head off on foot and find someone who can help whilst the woman stays in the car. She then falls asleep whilst waiting and wakes up to see a hideous person looking at her through the window. Thank goodness, the car is locked, so the person can't get in. But to her absolute horror, the person raises both of his arms to reveal they are holding her date-severed head in one hand and the car keys in the other. The fate of her is never revealed, and that's the end of the story. Spooky. It's a perfect campfire tale, of course it is. But any way you tell it, there are a load of similarities. Lovers, hook hands, cars, and grisly murder. But we don't really know anything about the man himself. We don't even know if it's ever an escaped mental patient, just like the radio said, or if it's a vengeful ghost. So we have no idea what he does outside of this little escapade that he does every once in a while, which makes writing a podcast episode about him and describing him quite tricky, really. But to talk about the complete opposite of tricky, the etymology is beyond self-explanatory. Hookman, English, it's a man with a hook for a hand. I don't know what else to tell you here if you haven't understood this etymology. I don't know what to tell you. Now, let's be clear before we kick off this origin segment like we usually do. This is a confirmed urban legend. There has never been any evidence behind the Hookman actually existing as its own entity, so I am just doing the Lord's work by spreading the story even more. So just to preamble everything, this is just a spooky story figure. I'm not telling you something about a real life serial killer that I'm infantilizing and putting down to a mythical monster. This is not a real thing. Interestingly though, with both cryptids and urban legends, we naturally assume that they are much younger in terms of history. However, this one is actually a bit older, and it's been around since the 1950s and 60s. This rumour started spreading in the early 50s and eventually made its roots in American folklore by 1959. According to historians, the first written mention of the Hook was within a Dear Abby column in 1960, which was kind of an agony aunt column in a newspaper. And actually, I have the exact extract, which is amazing. Dear Abby, if you are interested in teenagers, you will print this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it served its purpose for me. Othello and his date pulled into their favourite lover's lane to listen to the radio and do a little necking. The music was interrupted by an announcer who said there was an escaped convict in the area who had served time for rape and robbery. He was described as having a hook instead of a right hand. The couple became frightened and drove away. When the boy took his girl home, he went around to open the car door for her. Then he saw a hook on the door handle. I will never park to make out as long as I live. I hope this does the same for other kids. Jeanette. Well, Jeanette, necking is very outdated. And it really made me laugh. I had to stop recording that halfway through and just have a little giggle at the word necking. But how did this whole thing start going round in the 50s in the first place, if it's just an urban legend? Well, unfortunately, a lot of urban legends do stem from real-life events. And unfortunately, this one is no exception. In 1946, there was a spate of murders in lovers' lanes in Arkansas and Texas called the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, where 4 people were killed in the middle of the night, and the person responsible was never found. Following that, of course, if you're into true crime, you'll know about in the late 60s, the Zodiac Killer was doing the exact same thing in California, and again was never caught, and is probably one of the most famous serial killers to never be caught to this day. So there definitely is a real life fear and a lived experience historically of someone killing teenagers at these places at this time. You've got to think as well, the 50s and 60s were before all of the spates of murders in the US, with Ted Bundy, the son of Sam, Ed Kemper. All of these massive serial killers started within these next few years, and they were all killing teenagers, just never with a hook specifically. But it's still a very real life fear, and I'm sure there are people in the US who remember that too. Why do we think the hook was created though? Because it was created. The actual urban legend was fictional. Definitely by these teenagers, who were most likely attempting to scare others, but also, strangely enough, also by their parents. In the 50s and 60s, everyone was getting down to party and discovering the freedom of their bodies for the first time in literally historically ever. Teenage sex was seen as a massive issue, and coming up with a monster in a popular makeout spot was a perfect way to keep your child abstinent and safe from all of the dangers of teenage sex, especially when there was a lot less information about sex ed and birth control. In more modern examinations of the legend, there are also theories that the hook hand relates to castration, or even as a phallic symbol of some kind. It also links back to that idea of the risk of teenage sex, as a driver to keep them apart due to the hookman risk. Bill Ellis, a really great American folklorist, said, and I quote, "The threat of the hookman is not the normal sex drive of teenagers, but the abnormal drive of some adults to keep them apart." And I think that really does sum it up. The myth does come up within media very often still to this day, and recently in 2012 there was an infamous 4chan revival of the telling that was written in such broken English that it became a meme all on its own. I will share the post itself, the screenshot of it, on all of my socials, but I'm going to read it out the best I can now because I think it's hysterical. And I have to stress before I start that this is verbatim. I'm not making grammatical mistakes myself. This is how it was written. Man and girl go out to drive under moonlight. They stop at a side of road. He turned to his girl and say, "Baby, I love you very much." "What is it, honey?" "Our car has broken down. I think the engine is broken. I'll walk and get some more fuel." "Okay, I'll stay here and look after our stereo. There have been news report of stereos being broken." "Good idea. Keep the doors locked no matter what. I love you, sweaty." So the guy left to get full for the car. After 2 hours, the girl say, "Where is my baby? He was supposed to be back by now." Then the girl hear a scratching sound and her voice say, "Let me in." The girl doesn't do it, and then after a while she goes to sleep. The next morning she wakes up and finds her boyfriend still not there. She gets out to check, and man door, hand hook, car door. This absolutely knocked me when I first read it, and every time I think of it now, I have a little tiny giggle to myself. There are also another couple of other memes that are like this and are based on urban legends or on mythical creatures that are really funny, and there are dramatic readings of them all on YouTube as well, which are pretty funny. But people remember this meme, and so the Hookman lives on. We enjoy it because it's silly. Moving on though to other mythical comparisons, I'm going to go down the urban legend path here, and because of that, I'm going to talk about the Kuchisake Onna, which I covered not too long ago, a Japanese urban legend who corners you in a dark alleyway and asks if you think she's beautiful when she has a giant Glasgow smile on her face. Either way, you're not getting out without being maimed in the very least, but another wrong place, wrong time kind of monster. Slenderman, even, is a good one to compare this to, Another urban legend, but one that is 100% fictional, as I did cover in his episode, but something that just gets you whilst you're out in the woods, to keep you out of the woods. A nice and simple MO, just like our monster this week. And now, on to modern media. There's a whole load of Hook-themed monsters and myths around, and of course there's a few bits with the Hookman in himself, but I've also included some urban legend stuff in here too. For art, I'd recommend having a look at independent stuff this week because, of course, it's an urban legend, no one really knows what he looks like. So there's no portrait art of it like our traditional myth monsters, but there are some very cool bits out there for this one, so go find it. In movies, we have Candyman, Lover's Lane, Meatballs, Dick Tracy's Dilemma, Peter Pan, Hook, Final Exam, He Knows You're Alone, Shrek, The Thief and the Cobbler, 8 Crazy Nights, Adventures in Babysitting, The Hobbit, Campfire Tales, Godzilla, Evil Dead 2, Inspector Gadget, James Bond, Tangled, Jennifer's Body, Smoke, Puppet Master, The Mummy, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Battlegazi, Urban Legend, Saw, Cannibal Girls, and The Ring. For TV, we have Supernatural, Millennium, Designing Women, Doctor Who, The Muppet Show, CSI, Mythbusters, Lost Tapes, 1,000 Ways to Die, Urban Legends, Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction, Truth or Scare, Law and Order, Diary of the Wimpy Kid, Scrubs, Freaky Stories, Beetlejuice, Witchblade, Justified, Psych, Community, 30 Rock, SpongeBob SquarePants, Carmen Rider, Young Hercules, The Simpsons, South Park, The Venture Bros, Charlie the Unicorn, Homestar Runner, American Horror Story, and Nightmare Tales. I want to put out a special bulletin for the SpongeBob SquarePants episode with the hash-slinging slasher that is based on this exact urban legend. If you know it, you know it. It's very funny. In video games, we have ones such as Persona 2 and 4, Fear the Moon, Shin Megami Tensei, Touhou Project, Wick, Campfire Legends, Warcraft, Urban Rivals, Witchkin, Luigi's Mansion 3, Five Nights at Freddy's, Epic Mickey, Final Fantasy Rebirth, Pirate Hunters, Late Rites, Psychonauts, Beardblade, Monkey Island, and The Legend of Spyro the Eternal Night. My book recommendation this week is for Urban Legends, Strange Tales and Unsolved Mysteries from Around the World by James Proud, or if you're more into picture books, because why not, An Illustrated History of Urban Legends by Adam Alsuch-Boardman for some really spooky urban legends in here, and they are a bit spookier than I'd usually recommend, so do enjoy them. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? No. Quite simple on this one. It's an urban legend, and we all know these are designed to frighten people. And whilst I'd love to meet an actual person who has a hook hand, I can't say it's a common thing over here in the UK. I've never met someone with a hook hand. I'd love to. I want to ask all the questions, and I want to see how it opens a twisty door. That's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. The closest thing that I have seen to that is the attachment hooks that you can get for prosthetics, but they're not like Captain Hook hands, are they? I am talking about full blown, I want to see someone with a Captain Hook style hook. That's what I want. I think though that this is a really great example of a teenage prank, that you would probably get a deeper dive into something like American Horror Story or anything by Ryan Murphy, who loves directing things around urban legends like this. In fact, he did do something similar in American Horror Story 1984 and in Freak Show, and the character is played by the same guy, I think. So, I guess if you like that kind of show, knock yourself out, but I think that's one way you can go into a deep dive on this kind of urban legend and the history behind it, or at least the campness behind it. That's not to say I don't love an urban legend monster, because I really do. Two of my absolute faves are Bloody Mary and the Kuchisakiona, but I love both of these monsters not because they're urban legends, but because of their link to femininity and that idea of summoning them, which I think is fun. The hook is different, but it's definitely one that I love because of the whole 80s slasher movie vibes that I get from it. He really gives me a Freddy Krueger feel to him, you know? Not that I can watch horror movies. I caught a 2-second glimpse of the new Smile film on TikTok the other day, and I did not sleep all night. I also decided to watch that new movie Fresh, and I say it's new, it came out 2 years ago, with Sebastian Stan, and he's a cannibal in it, and it's horrible, and I couldn't eat my dinner last night. It was a very good movie, but it was very scary. I am not the person to come to say, oh, I love Freddy Krueger. I'm not that gal, but he gives me those vibes. But what do you think? Did the hook target teenagers or naive kids summoning in mirrors like Candyman? Let me know on Twitter. I would love to know what you think about this one. I have loved covering this, and I've actually been super excited to write about it. Not to say that I didn't find this one quite creepy, because you're definitely not going to catch me trying to bring this upon me in any way. You won't find me up any lovers' lanes. I can't drive either, so probably wouldn't happen. Next week, though, we're heading back over to home turf in Britain and heading to the Cornish countryside for a Harry Potter favourite, I am sure, for some pesky pixies. Get ready to cast Immobulus on these little pests next Thursday, and we'll be ready to tackle them together. For now, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads, and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. And you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee, and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.